A world without nuclear weapons. Barack Obama spearheads United Nations efforts. He says the US is back as a team player and intends to lead by example. Is it a lofty aspiration, a serious commitment, or just a political maneuver against Iran? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the show. I'm Nick Clark. Making nuclear arms history. World leaders at the United Nations Security Council vowed to stop the spread of atomic weapons. On Thursday, the 15-member council unanimously adopted a resolution aimed at nuclear disarmament. US President Barack Obama praised the resolution. He called it historical.
The historic resolution we just adopted enshrines our shared commitment to the goal of a world without nuclear weapons. And it brings Security Council agreement on a broad framework for action to reduce nuclear dangers as we work toward that goal.
Well, in a nutshell, the security resolution expects all member states to prevent proliferation and lower the risk of nuclear terrorism. To that effect, member states are expected to improve security measures for nuclear material. They must also cooperate with the International Atomic Energy Agency, that is the IAEA, an essential move to verify whether a state is in compliance with its obligations, doing what it's supposed to do, in other words. The signatories also agreed to organise a nuclear security summit next year, and the resolution also proposed ways to deter any nation from withdrawing from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So there we have it. Joining us are our guests in San Jose, California, Stephen Zunas. He's a professor of international studies at the University of San Francisco. And in Chicago, Andy Martin. He's the author of the book Obama, the Man Behind the Mask, and he's also running to be the Republican candidate for the Illinois Senate. And Mr. Martin, if I may start with you. A world free of nuclear weapons, so says Barack Obama. That's a pretty good presidential ambition, isn't it?
Well, I think it's a pretty good gift to the Republican Party. The United States of America is not going to disarm unilaterally or otherwise. And while Barack Obama's rhetoric is getting a little stale here in the United States, my guess is the rest of the world is now going to get a dose of the same promise too much and deliver too little strategy. It's a totally ridiculous proposal, vacuous. There are all kinds of unsolved problems at the UN. And none of them have been solved. None of them can be solved without an adequate enforcement mechanism. When Barack Obama carries a big stick, in former President Teddy Roosevelt's expression, then I'll start to believe him. But all as long as he's carrying big words and big promises and big talk, I think his game is just about over.
So, Stephen Zunas, big promises, big talk, game almost over. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, isn't it?
Yes, but it's also true that it's not just Barack Obama's been talking about. Even some of the hardcore realists like Henry Kissinger, Brent Stowcroft, W. Brzezinski, and others have been talking about the need for total nuclear disarmament. That there's no way of curbing the threat of proliferation to Iran, North Korea, other countries, as long as the major powers continue to have their arms. I mean, not only is that pretty logical just in terms of you can't continually impose a regime of haves and have-nots, but the Non-Proliferation Treaty requires that in return for new nations not developing nuclear weapons, the 5 existing nuclear powers at the time of the treaty of 1968, that is the United States, Russia, China, France, and Britain, have to make good faith efforts for verifiable total disarmament.
Isn't that this eternal paradox, Stephen Zunas, that a world with nuclear weapons is actually safer than one without? Barack Obama knows that, doesn't he?
Actually, we've been pretty lucky so far, to be honest. As long as that threat remains, the world is far less stable, especially when you have, especially with the technology being such that it is easy to spread to other countries. You can always get demagogues who will try to say, hey, if they have it, why can't we have it? I mean, why should Iran take seriously, for example, UN Security Council resolutions, calling for them to end their processing of uranium, as long as Pakistan and India are in violation of Resolution 1172, which requires them to get rid of their nuclear arsenal altogether, or Israel is in violation of UN Security Council Resolution 487, which requires that they open up their nuclear facilities to IAEA inspections. So as long as we have this double standard that it's going to risk further proliferation, the only way to real stability is to have a law-based universalist principle. That's the only thing that's worked in disarmament talks before.
Andy Martins, no doubt about it. Double standards are on display here, aren't they?
I think the United Nations should start with a breakfast law and stop the proliferation of sugary cereals and fattening sugared drinks. And once they've conquered breakfast cereal and sugared drinks, then they should take on nuclear weapons. It is totally unrealistic to assume the Pakistanis are going to disarm, or that if the Pakistanis do not disarm, the Indians will. And of course, we always come back to the Middle East crisis. The likelihood that Israel is going to open its undisclosed weapons program to UN inspection and to international control is absolutely zero. So the day that I see inspectors at Dimona in Israel inspecting their reactors and looking at their weapons, I will know that change is coming.
But let's face it, Mr. Martin, I just want to jump in there because the UN Security Council, let's face it, it's a pretty representative organization and has made its aim very clear. It agrees that Obama's plan is a viable, if distant, goal.
Well, I mean, when you put the adjective in distant, it won't be in my lifetime and it won't be in your lifetime, because politics is not going to change and people are not going to disarm. The other thing that you're leaving out is that with the proliferation of technology, it's like putting the genie back in the bottle. People are making all kinds of weapons and bombs and using technology. Nuclear weapons do provide a stabilizing factor. I don't know that the Chinese are going to want to give up their nuclear arsenal. So when you say Obama has goals, well, of course, and he has a medical plan that will not kick in with the expenses until after he's out of office.
Okay,
so
let's throw that back to Stephen Nunes. Let's throw that back to Stephen Nunes. The thing is, who is going to be the first country to completely disarm? No one's ever going to take that step. It'll leave them completely unprotected.
And that's why it has to be a universal kind of thing. This is why this idea of nuclear party.
But practically, how can you see that through?
The United States can somehow, through a comprehensive disarmament regime, through the International Atomic Energy Agency, where inspectors oversee the dismantling of the weapons. We have seen that in terms of the partial disarmament agreements between the United States and Soviet Union and more recently Russia, where both sides were more or less simultaneously were able to disarm certain classes of weapon system. So it's basically the same kind of mechanism, only on a much broader scale.
The trouble is that, we're talking about a nuclear-free world at some point in the future, but countries like the United Kingdom, well, they've just ordered in 3, maybe 4 new nuclear submarines.
And it's very unfortunate. In fact, I mean, I don't see how the British government or any other government that especially is wagging its finger at Iran right now can expect that Iran or any other country is going to take that kind of thing seriously as long as they are adding to their nuclear capabilities. Again, the part of the deal with the NPT was that the existing powers would take good faith efforts to disarm, and as long as this double standard remains, it plays in the hands of Ahmadinejad and other demagogues who are trying to use that nuclear card to their advantage.
Andy Martin, I can see you want to jump in there.
Well, I will give you one unlikely exception. If Israel were to trigger World War III by attacking Iran, that might create such an unusual situation, as indeed World War II did in World War I, that it might require coercive measures by the United Nations to ban all nuclear weapons. But I don't see how you can tell Iran they're not entitled to nuclear weapons when the Israelis clearly have them. And while I absolutely deplore and condemn the vile Iranian rhetoric, there's equally vile rhetoric against the Palestinians and the Iranians. Everybody's trying to demagogue each other. And international treaties are not going to override political demagoguery. If Bibi Netanyahu tomorrow announced that he was disarming Israel's nuclear arsenal, his government would fall within minutes, not even hours. And so these are totally unrealistic statements. And, you know, Barack Obama is governing with rhetoric and not with reality. That's his weakness. And his foreign policy right now is in a shambles. It's not going to recover, I don't think, in the next 3 years.
Let's examine the mechanism that was put in place to stop the spread of nuclear weapons, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It's said that it is looking increasingly fragile. Stephen Eunice, is that what you believe?
I'm afraid so, and again, it's critical that the existing nuclear powers take the lead, and it's quite possible for the United Nations to take coercive measures. I mean, the main problem involving the scores of UN Security Council resolutions that Israel's violating, for example, is that the United States has blocked any kind of enforcement mechanisms. You could say the same for Morocco vis-a-vis Western Sahara and about a half dozen other issues. So it's a matter of political will. The mechanisms are certainly there.
Mr. Martin, the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, is up for revision in May. Do you think it really needs to be bolstered? Do you think it's fragile too?
Well, I'm always prepared to believe that international diplomats will bolster their rhetoric. But the rhetoric of the United Nations is far divorced from the reality of national self-interest. And I think when you get down to what Mr. Zunis is saying, he has a much higher aspirational belief in the progress. But at the bottom level, at the operational level, he agrees completely with me that change is not likely to come without coercion. And I see no prospect of coercion, and I don't see any leadership in the world strong enough to bring it about. I don't think the Chinese are going to be anxious to disarm. Their answer is there hasn't been a war for 60 years. Let's go on to a more pressing problem.
So what do? We just continue building nuclear weapons? The arsenals keep on increasing?
No, I think the Soviet Union and the United States have a practical approach. They are gradually reducing their stockpiles to more manageable and reasonable levels. But there's also a need to modernize the nuclear arsenal, the factor that has been ignored. Our weapons leaders know, and our military advisors know, that the weapons stockpile today is quite ancient. And probably many of these weapons, and certainly the delivery systems, would qualify for a state pension in Britain or Social Security in America. We have airplanes, bombers that are older than the pilots. So I think a gradual modernization, an approach that looks towards nuclear safety, and an international police force that does try to discourage proliferation are practical. I mean, we did get the Libyans to give up their program because they wanted something. They wanted to be back in the international community. Gaddafi wanted to be able to speak to the United Nations. He wanted some legitimacy, and he was willing to trade his nuclear program for that. So I'm not a complete pessimist, but I think a very, very strong protective American foreign policy is necessary.
Forgive me for interrupting, but you can't discuss nuclear issues without talking about Iran these days, and this conversation hasn't been any different. Last week, Iran, of course, informed the IAEA, the world's nuclear watchdog, of a new uranium enrichment plant, but it's believed the emission only came when Iran learned that this plant was known to foreign intelligence, while the Iranian president said his nation was keeping nothing from international inspectors. Barack Obama, of course, had a very different view.
This site deepens a growing concern that Iran is refusing to live up to those international responsibilities, including specifically revealing all nuclear-related activities. As the international community knows, this is not the first time that Iran has concealed information about its nuclear program.
Iran, of course, insists it did no wrong. The head of Iran's nuclear program, Ali Akbar Salih, said he is surprised with the West's response.
We announced this new site by sending a letter to the International Atomic Energy Agency, and we have done this measure in the framework of the IAEA laws. We are completely stunned by the West's reaction to the plant.
Well, still with us are our guests in San Jose, Stephen Zunis, in Chicago, Andy Martin. And now joining us, I'm pleased to say, for this part of the show from Birmingham in the United Kingdom, Chris Emery. He's an Iran specialist from the University of Birmingham. Chris Emery, the G5+1 are meeting on October the 1st in order to really test how serious Iran is about coming clean on its uranium enrichment program. given that, this revelation about a so-called secret facility is pretty timely, isn't it?
It is pretty timely. It is, of course, very much a political announcement that is not necessarily indicative of Iran's a greater urgency in terms of Iran's capability. But it's fair to say that Iran has been perhaps caught, if not lying, but then not necessarily disclosing everything it should. And yes, to an extent that will create more tension at the meeting and will raise expectations of Iran to really come through with a concrete delivery. Whether it does or not remains to be seen.
What is your view, Chris Emery, about Iran's capability?
I think that at the moment we have very little evidence of what Iran's nuclear capabilities in terms of its weapons program. I think that it's impossible to say, and I see little point in really putting Iran's intentions on trial, because how do you really assess a nation's intentions? I think that the key point is that this facility doesn't really tell us that much more, certainly about Iran's intention to weaponize, or more broadly, of the timetable in which it could achieve nuclear enrichment.
Stephen Zunis, little point in putting Iran's intentions on trial. What do you say to that?
Well, it's very hard to judge. I mean, strictly speaking, the Iranians are correct in that they are required to disclose this sort of thing 6 months prior to the loading of nuclear fuel, and they argue that it's more than 6 months before they need to do that, so they haven't been hiding anything. Again, technically speaking, that's true, though this hasn't done a lot to help build trust with the international community, that's for sure. And then there's a question of what does this do? I mean, it looks like this is capable of only maybe about 3,000 centrifuges compared to 50,000 natanz. It's not like it's a huge supplement. And are they really the high level grade that President Obama and the other Western leaders have been accusing? I haven't seen this evidence. I mean, it could be medium level grade for medical or technical purposes like they claim. It's hard to say. We really need to know. I think the key is whether Iran will indeed, as they say, will open this up to inspection, so the IAEA can really get some assessment of what they're up to.
Andy Martin, what's your view of all this focus on Iran's perceived capability?
Well, let's come back to the real world. You know, as you pointed out, I'm a candidate for office, so I have to generate support among voters. And let me come to the defense of Israel. I don't think that there's any need to force the Israelis to disarm. I would not vote to force Israel to disarm. And I think the chances that the U.S. Congress is going to force the Israelis to disarm is exactly zero. So Israel is very much a linchpin here because they are a nuclear power, although an undisclosed one. And all fingers will always point back to them as the exception. But the American political climate is not in favor of disarming Israel. And even while I might occasionally criticize them for their inappropriate policies with regard to the Palestinians, I certainly would never suggest any coercion forcing them to disarm vis-a-vis their nuclear program. I think the world is safer when people have the burden of justifying and restraining their ambitions based on nuclear reality. I am not afraid of the Iranian nuclear program any more than I'm afraid of the Israeli nuclear program or the American nuclear program. Politicians love to use inflated rhetoric, but the reality is that there is no evidence that any state possessing nuclear weapons today is in a hostile mode. We don't have saber rattling, we don't have threats.
All right.
The real problem that we face is not nuclear proliferation by states, it's outlaw organizations, Al-Qaeda weapons.
Okay,
and
let's bring in Chris Emery, because we haven't heard much from him. Let me put that point to you, Mr. Emery. Do you think it's right that Israel is an exception, that Pakistan is proving to be an exception, that India is an exception?
Well, I think that allegation of hypocrisy is very much at the centre of Iran's approach to this issue. In terms of how will that affect engagement between Iran and the West, the fact remains that the US do not find the Israeli nuclear program an issue of concern, and frankly, we can debate whether that's fair or unfair. The reality is that it really doesn't have any bearing on the West's position. It may indeed very much affect how the US perceive, the Iranians perceive the issue, but I think it's a bit of a distraction for what's going to happen in Geneva.
All right, so Stephen Zunis said, what about all this talk of sanctions? Russia, they say they are keen to join the fold to apply sanctions, but it's slightly contradictory because on the one hand they say that sanctions don't generally work, but in this case with Iran, they may just go for it.
It's hard to say. I mean, on the one hand, when a state continually flaunts the will of the UN Security Council, they feel there's a need to ratchet up the pressure. At the same time, it's only going to harden the Iranian government's position. I mean, as much opposition there is within Iran of the political repression, the corruption, the apparent stolen election, that kind of thing, it's been quite striking how the Iranian opposition, almost across the board, supports the government on the nuclear question. So if the international community tightens the screws, it's going to enable Ahmadinejad and the hardliners just to play the nationalist card and defy the international community even more, because it plays to their advantage in terms of the internal political situation. So it doesn't make a lot of sense, frankly, to ration up the pressure. But if the international community doesn't feel like they can't be shown to be backing down. I mean, as a parent, I can kind of identify with that in the sense that you lay it down and the child still disobeys, and you realize the punishment's not going to do any good, but you got to you got to show your credibility by following through.
Chris Emery, what do you think? You're the expert on Iran. Do you reckon it's playing into their hands?
I think it was a mistake, indeed, to allow Ahmadinejad to present this as first of all, a case of hypocrisy, and second of all, the obviously politicized announcement really shows that they are setting up perhaps the debate in Geneva across unfair pre-existing lines. So yes, I think there is certainly a danger that Ahmadinejad will be able to make some political capital out of that. That said, I think the current tensions within Iran's political system are essentially immune to Western posturing in terms of that's a very clear power struggle that's occurring behind the scenes, in which really the international community can only play a particularly significant role.
Okay, Andy Martin, very, very briefly, 30 seconds if you will. You do not support Mr. Obama, as you've made very clear, but whatever you say, there is a definite change in mood right now about this whole nuclear issue. In 20 seconds, in fact, how do you assess, where do you think that might lead?
We're going nowhere. This is all political rhetoric. One of my opponents wants to turn off gasoline to Iran. The more we bash the Iranian government, the stronger we make the Ayatollahs. If we want change in Iran, we've got to lower the temperature, not raise it, remove the hypocrisy, not increase the hypocrisy. And that's what a sane foreign policy would do. Obama's policy is not sane.
All right, well, a lot of people would disagree with you, sir, but we have run out of time right now, and that is it. Andy Martin, Stephen Zunis, Chris Emery, thank you very much indeed. And thank you for watching this edition of Inside Story. We would, of course, love to hear from you. Thoughts and suggestions, always keen to hear from our viewers. Just email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. From me, Nick Clark, it's goodbye.